Hey everyone, Cynics here. It's time for more Paintover Pals. This is my Paintover series where I get to help patrons improve their art. And just so you know, as not to get carried away rendering, I make sure to only spend 45 minutes on each paintover. Improving at art is mostly just improving at observation, so be sure to critique along at home and maybe practice doing paintovers yourself. I have a bunch to get through today, so let's get into it. First up, we have some art by Larry. This grayscale painting is coming along nicely. We have some interesting textures and distinct lighting. There are a couple quick fixes I want to make right away. The neck feels incredibly long to me, so I'm just going to cut that and move that around a little bit. Remember, the neck length doesn't end in relationship to where it goes into the clothing. It should end in relationship to the shoulder height. I also think the face feels a bit long from where it inserts into the gas mask thing, so I'm going to shrink that in a bit. Probably the biggest and easiest fix we can do involves the background gradient. At the moment, when I blur my eyes, the chest area is easily the most readable and contrasting shape. We want to reserve that for the face. Luckily, the face is already getting a nice framing from the mask and the black hair, so let's focus on just knocking the chest back into a dark background and removing all of its visual attention. I always enjoy a strong secondary light, but there's one object in the image that you forgot to apply the lighting to, and that is the smoke. Smoke has volume and does reflect light, so try to apply the lighting to it as best you can. Clouds and smoke are difficult, but do your best to imagine a 3D volume for it that has some fun shape design. I didn't get too experimental this time, but smoke is a really great place to show off your artistic style and treat it like a fun graphic element. I think the face can use a bit more depth and contrast around the eyes. The atypical lighting might make this a bit dubious, but try to find some part of the eye socket and even the orb of the eye to get pushed deeper into shadow. Let's see, at the end of my time on this one, I'm going to try to rework the values on the industrial stuff a bit. I want to make sure it gets treated differently than the skin and focused more on the shape instead of the line. One functionality change I forgot to mention earlier was making those little hoses that attach to the neck feel like they have some extra give in them. They were too direct before and would have prevented any potential head movements if you had to, eventually animate this or rig it for 3D. Anyway, I like the loss of detail on the shadow side, but remember that the edge of the light and shadow is a great place to build up a little extra surface detail before diving away from detail. There we go, and overall, I think I'm okay with these improvements for 45 minutes of work. Next up is this one by Kyle Van Riper. This is a digital painting portrait, so it's right in my comfort zone. The colors are generally fine, but some of the brushwork is getting a bit messy. The nose is feeling extremely high contrast on the face, so I'm going to just bump that back a bit and hit everything with some general color zones to smooth things out. I like softening things up because then you get to come back in and redefine the key corners of contrast and ambient occlusion. The eyes, nostrils, and corners of the mouth. One of the easiest places to improve was definitely the planes around the mouth. They were extremely undefined at first, which made the lighting feel inconsequential, but a couple defined places above and below the mouth will make the whole face feel much better. I think the white eyes were a purposeful decision, so in order to make them look purposefully finished, I just need to make sure they have some sphere shading and then hit them with a little specularity to match the scene. The whole image also had a very tiny red rim light and it was almost invisible, so since there isn't already some other dynamic lighting on the face, this feels like a great chance to go extra big and bold with that red light. Make big shapes and just have fun with them. Let them define the planes of the face a lot more. I did some standard touch-ups here and there, mostly getting rid of some sketch lines and just blocking things out more, but I think this one is pretty much done. The before and after really stands out to me, mostly for the added definition around the mouth, but I think everything's working pretty well. Moving along, here is a painting by Jennifer Aaron. Right off the bat, this rendering quality looks really nice, so good job, Jennifer. Of course, this means it will be much harder to make any paint over changes look good in my short amount of time, so be sure to take these more as potential directions than as solid before and after improvement. There are a couple places that do feel like they can't have an overall adjustment. The breasts seem extremely low on the rib cage. Judging from the rendering we can see, it looks like they actually start really low. So you can either change the rendering to make them look like they at least fill out in a way that implies a higher starting point, or maybe just move everything up. And I decided to just move everything up because that seemed easier at the time. I couldn't really polish it too much though, but the other easy fix that jumped out at me was the lack of cast shadows from all of the various jewelry and glasses. A quick hint of those shadows should set them in the scene more. You can also add some cast lighting effects from the lenses of the glasses, for fun if you want to. But after that, there's a lot of minor things that can be adjusted. Some of the ambient occlusion spots feel a bit too low contrast, but I think I want to mention that the overall hues of the image are fairly monochromatic. I can't pull it off super well because I haven't taken the time to practice it enough myself, but I personally think it's really nice when white clothing has a bit of a prismatic hue variation in it. And I'm thinking of artists like Ray17 on Twitter for that. I tried to throw in some cyan and peach colors without too much success, but the good news is this has all made me super interested in getting good at this in the future and maybe making a video on this type of color stylization. But for now, I'll have to defer my hopes for pulling that off. So one last thing that seems like a good idea when I saw this image as a thumbnail would be to have a bit more of an overall gradation into shadow as we go further down the illustration, just to make the clothes feel more cohesive with each other. I'll airbrush in that deeper tone over the figure, and I do think that actually this would work quite well if you polished it up a bit. So I wish I could have executed all of those concepts better, but hopefully that helped regardless. So new clothing tutorials coming soon. Alright, let's try this one by Choco. This feels like a dwarven character for a D&D campaign or something. Overall, let's start with another quick background fix. The character values are quite bright near the top, so an easy improvement is to make the background darker around the head. It might feel a bit repetitive in this video, but I am also going to push darker gradations in the skin tone. Deeper tones around the eyes and nose are always a nice adjustment that doesn't take too much time. The teeth also felt too simple and close to white, so I'm just bumping up the levels of depth around all of these things. There is also a bit of room to adjust the shape design and simplicity of the hair and fur collar, but I don't want to focus entirely on that. I think the biggest improvement would probably come from adjusting the clothing and the clothing folds specifically. They're way too chaotic, so we need to simplify them way back and really find the areas of rest as well as the strongest dominant folds to focus on. I'm going to keep it toward the bold side of things and not get rid of them entirely, so I'll mostly just explore how I would aim to keep the same overall feeling in a more aesthetic way. This applies to the pants, the boots, the shirt, and even the jacket. They were all just a tad too chaotic. And finally, the metal shoes can certainly be a bit more focused on the directional lighting and how it will hit not only the planes of the shoes, but also the seams between those planes. I'm feeling pretty okay with those changes overall, so I think that's a fairly solid 45-minute improvement. Next up is VA. VA asked me to pick the image, so I decided to go with this one with the dynamic lighting. They also seem to be interested in getting better at animal materials, so I'll try to incorporate that. Right off the bat, there is way too much detail in the shadows, so I'm just going to shrink the dynamic range a whole bunch. If we do that properly, we should only now be focused on showing detail in the light, and all of those shadow areas should just blend together. I'm even going to emphasize that on the cat as well, so just shrink all those shadows back into a general shadow tone. Judging from the cast shadow, the top of the cat's head is definitely in shadow as well, and I can add back in some sense of detail in the background, but I do want it to remain super low contrast. The lighting effect is going to be hit with a stronger glowing feel, so that should be nice, and all of that cat hair is going to be blended together a lot more. To be fair, I'm totally making this cat's hair a lot longer, but it gives a little bit of something extra to practice. All of that texture should really be coming through on the breaks between light and shadow. I really want to avoid using black in the light areas as well, so anything that is creating a strong bit of ambient occlusion in the light can just be shown with some deep orange tones. This is most notable in the face. After fiddling around more and adjusting the colors, I realized that the composition did feel like it had some unnecessary space, so I did crop it down a bit, and I like that better. So fun finishing touches are a bit of glow from the side where the main light is coming from, and also a bit of cat hair and dust floating around in the air just for movement. That all went pretty smoothly, and I'm happy with the result. Certainly more of a lighting showcase than anything, but lighting is everything in painting. Anyway, let's check out this art by Sunny. This painting is looking fairly ambitious, so that's awesome. Lots of intricate details in the stained glass and whatnot. Sadly, I think the biggest issue with this image is the general brightness of the stained glass. Judging from the surroundings, it's clear that this is meant to take place at night, but those windows are so brightly illuminated. Without a strong light behind them, they should really just wash out into darker tones. So I'm just going to wash them back into some nice blue background tones, and then maybe just hit some of the upward facing shards of broken glass with a little bit of light. I'm also just going to be pushing the whole image back into the deeper bluish tones, maybe to make it look more like nighttime. And I think catching some highlights from the moon on the top of some of those plants at the top of the image would be fun as well. Cyan works pretty well for those midnight highlights. I'm spending a lot of time building up some denser edge details on the foliage, and also just more contrast as well to make them read better from far away. The character with the fox looks nice. I'm going to try and sync them into the surrounding tones a little bit more with some gradation, and maybe just a hint more of detail loss in the shadows and chunkier details in the light as well. Somewhat similar to what I did in the previous cat paintover. Once again, my rendering is going to be super messy, but hopefully the color concepts start reading better on the whole. I think there's potentially a handful of different ways to add more atmosphere to this image. Personally, I think adding some fireflies to the image would be a lovely way to get some extra movement and kind of mood stuff going on. Fireflies just make everything better. I also experimented with some quick effects. I added some wispy smoke effect just as a way to tie in the full composition. I don't know, it's kind of weird, but it felt interesting to me. So that's gonna do it for this one. Aside from being a bit rough, I think it certainly feels much closer to nighttime now, and I like those changes. Next we have a regular paintover pal. It's Richard Hayes. It looks like we got a lot of texture going on in this painting, and I generally like the way that looks. As it seems to be a theme in this video, I'm once again going to squint my eyes and try to decide if the background is complementing the face as well as it can. I don't want to change the mood too much, but I think just a hint more darkness in the background can make the face stand out just a little bit more. Maybe some deeper red tones on the border of the face as well. The biggest thing I really want to focus on, though, is going to be the back. In theory, the planes of the back are generally all facing the same direction, so I think the harshness of the current shadow tone that cuts across those planes is just a bit overboard. I'm going to really make it a lot more subtle. There's not really a whole lot of ins and outs going on in that area, so in order for it to not be super boring, I'm just going to try to render it more. The easiest trick I can do is some slightly grayish bounced light on one side, but I'll probably just spend most of the time just trying to hint at minor anatomical forms around the shoulder blade without making things too harsh. I also brought some reddish tones into the hair and skin to balance things out with the overwhelmingly cool tone of the image. And Richard specifically asked if I had any tips for helping colorblind artists add better red tones, and I can't really speak to that with any familiarity. I mainly just tried to introduce red in the border areas that seem to face toward other areas of skin without really affecting the overall value much. If the values are good, you can get away with anything really, but do try to introduce a nice ratio of overall hues from the opposite side of the spectrum into a few key areas, or even just along the break between shadow and light, depending on the surface. Anyway, I won't be able to match the texture in the paint over exactly, but I think the overall back is feeling much more realistic and cohesive with the lighting scheme now. There's a couple little touches I can throw in, mostly extra contrast around the eye, but I think that's about it. I'm happy with the results, and you might notice that when I toggle the paint over off and on, it feels like it's doing a better job at trapping your attention inside of the face area. On to the next one. We have some art here by Tate Riley. At first I considered just focusing on the drawing side of things and redrawing this from a slightly more dynamic angle, because it is pretty hard to make things dynamic if the portrait is too squared up in the frame, but I decided to offer a more painterly approach instead. The original felt like it was mostly being carried by the line work, so in order to embrace painting, I'm just going to really push it all back into murky values and then pull out the forms again just using shapes of light and shadow. I tried to get rid of any unnecessary complexity in the hood shape and really just focus on some longer swooping shapes. For whatever reason, I kept thinking that the original had a more bluish skin tone, so I don't know why I got that in my head, but I think it was actually gray. I didn't notice at the time, but I added some blues in the skin tone, and really the whole image just felt incredibly bright from the start, so maybe I overcorrected by going super dark with this entire thing, but that somewhat felt like a more fitting mood overall. I did like adding in those little sprouts and flowers coming from the wrappings, but maybe I should have adjusted the overall character design a bit more. I could have made those a bit bigger and just kind of worked with the design in terms of that. It's always hard to decide if I should be focused more on the rendering or more on the design. Regardless, this image was feeling a bit Dave Raposa-esque in its tone, and certainly the way I rendered it, so I decided to just lean into that more and add a gray secondary light off to the side. The full Dave Raposa. And overall, I think it's a pretty dramatic change in the paint over, and hopefully it still maintains the right intention. Let's try another one though. Here is a portrait painting by Patrick. Certainly a lot of portraits today. Right off the bat, I do enjoy that they went all in on the painting side of things, but this is one of those cases where a little more definitive edge control would help the readability a whole lot. So normally I'm shifting things away from relying on line art, but this time I'm going to bring back in line work in order to get more clarity. For the record, it is important to work on both skills together and constantly let your drawing skills enhance your painting skills, and your painting skills enhance your drawing skills. It works really good when you're just leveling both things together. Because of the looseness in the original image, I honestly wasn't sure what a lot of the details were meant to represent. There was some implied white shape going across the cheek, so I just kind of guessed and decided that might be an oxygen tube, but I can't know for sure. Anyway, I tried to guess at most of these shapes and wound up with some lines that felt reasonable. Once I finished that line art, the whole image was feeling a bit washed out, so I did darken all of the values a bit, and that certainly helps. So moving along to painterly stuff, anything around the eyes is always a focal point by default, so I wanted to have some fun with the glasses. Painting everything behind the lenses with some darker tones is a nice way to imply a good tint on the glasses. You can follow that up with some bold light shapes on top of the lenses to imply reflections of an environment. It's pretty fun to do. Once that was done, I just smudged a lot of the colors into each other and then redefined some of the key spots with some harder edges. Going back and forth between softening everything and redefining things is an enjoyable way to paint. Sadly, all of that line art and then painting took up a huge amount of time, so I did run out of time making everything fancier, but I think the general concept of what to focus on in the future is there. The before and after feels pretty solid, so I'm still curious if I completely misinterpreted things or not, but I enjoy how it came out. Anyway, I have 2 more today, so this next one is from Automatic Man. It's a creepy digital illustration with some zombie neighbors walking an evil wolf dog thing. I'll try another side-by-side paint over for this one. So the first thing I noticed when zoomed out is that the head of the dog just kind of flows into the paw next to it. They're also the same size. Other than that, the overall image is really carried heavily by some yellow rim light lines, and when I squint my eyes, that's kind of all I see. I'm going to try and fix the dog first, since that's the main element though. I'll lower the paw down a bit so it's not in line with the head anymore, but I feel like I really just want to redo the head. So the mouth is extremely bright in the original, but it's also very boxy. I think it might be more intimidating if everything was more angular, and I think if we can see the top of the nose just a bit so we can really show the wrinkling that happens when a dog is snarling or being aggressive, that would just be nicer. That whole snarling look is just super important for a dog to be scary. I haven't painted much stuff like this before, so it's going to be a bit rough looking, just adding a lot more forms around the eyes and face of the dog. But when it comes to the spit flying out of its mouth, you can mostly just focus on thinner lines here and there just to catch the speculars of the drool instead of making it all bright. But yeah, I spent a lot of my time on the face just kind of reshaping the mouth and the teeth and getting everything to look a little more realistic. I don't know if it does or not. I'm not an animal anatomy expert yet. Maybe someday. But anyway, I redrew the paws as well, but I did have to start rushing through the rest of this image as I was running low on time. In order to get away from those thin yellow lines in the background, I made the characters read more with bigger shapes instead. I wasn't overly clear on where to take the background exactly though, so I just experimented around frantically with a bunch of different things and then wound up leaving it somewhat ambiguous and unfinished. So it's far from perfect, but I did tackle a few important things to look out for, and overall, hopefully you feel like it's an improvement. I think if I had a lot more time, I would probably focus more on the overall value mapping of the composition, because that can still be improved a lot to be more dynamic. Finally, this last image I have is by Kalia, another regular of the show. We have a portrait of a fish creature lady, and it's looking good, maybe a bit high on the overall saturation levels, and definitely a little bit harsh on some of the contrast. Now, full disclosure, I actually messed up recording a little bit at the start of this, so there might be a small jump, but I was mostly just blending some colors around and lowering the saturation a bit. Oh, and I made the ears more glowy and fairy wing-like. Anyway, I did want to add some advice about surface texture. I don't mind what they started with too much, but I think in the painting stage you can be a little bit softer with some of the texture indications. Once again, the terminating shadow lines are a great place to focus on the detail of the texture, but you can also just show finer textures with specularity. A bit of a fish scale-like shimmer can go a pretty long way. Moving along, the background is certainly bold and colorful, so I don't want to abandon it, but I think letting those colors bleed into the main form might help a bit. I redefined the hair on the right with a much bolder light area and just a couple soft edges. It can also have a bit of a shimmer to it and a couple specular highlights anywhere the overall form curves around past the light. Honestly, I might have gone way overboard with the sparkles and shimmers because I'm starting to get some serious Lisa Frank vibes off this one. Girls will definitely be throwing this on their binder for the first day of middle school. I messed around with some ideas for the eyes, but didn't manage to cheat myself into anything great, so I just settled for more speculars, although in hindsight, I think they're a bit much, so consider that a misstep. The last thing I want to do is some background adjusting. I'm going to keep the colors, like I said, mostly intact, but just adjust some of the shapes. The area on the left was following the silhouette of the hair a bit, so I broke that up more, and on the right it just needed some more depth. The final touch is just a quick airbrush across the center of the face to bring back some of the original colors, and I think it's done. Overall, aside from my eye speculars, I'm pretty happy with this one. It definitely has a nice feel when you zoom in. Alright, so that was a lot of paintovers. Hopefully you all learned some interesting little tidbits here and there. At the very least, I want to thank you all so much for watching this video. Any engagement is always appreciated. The biggest thank you, of course, goes out to the Patreon crowd, and especially the bold artists who let me critique their work for this video. You guys are wonderful. See you, everyone.